לכבודו של סם, אני אדבר באנגלית. So it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here this afternoon with you. And I'd like to thank Snait in particular for the kind invitation. The trouble with life, according to Martin Amis, is, quote, its amorphousness, its ridiculous fluidity. Look at it. Thinly plotted, largely themeless, sentimental and ineluctably trite. The dialogue is poor, or at least violently uneven. The twists are either predictable or sensationalist, and it's always the same beginning and the same ending. Twain put his finger on a more fundamental conundrum beyond the concerns of the novelist. What a wee part of a person's life are his acts and his words, he wrote. His real life is led in his head and is known to none but himself. All day long, the mill of his brain is grinding, and his thoughts, not those of other things, are his history. These are his life, and they are not written. Every day would make a whole book of 80,000 words, 365 books a year. Biographies are but the clothes and buttons of the man. The biography of the man himself cannot be written. So it's both impossible to write them, and even if it were possible, it would make little sense. Charming. But how we love biographies. Biographies are courted by editors and perennially adorned bestseller lists. They are, for many of us, some of our best remembered reads, trusted windows into the soul, what we call the human condition. Depending on their hero, they are also a window into art, history, poetry, politics and world affairs, military strategy, music, literature, sports, comedy, philosophy. And if the nearly 5,000 lives of scientists, engineers, and medical men and women printed over the past 400 years are any indication, then they are a preferred prism into science too. The first vitae of the new men of science, Copernicus, Tycho, Peiresc, Galileo, appeared in the 17th century, and we have never looked back. It was 10 a year by the end of the 19th century, and it's 10 times that today. Add the innumerable obituaries, entries in biographical dictionaries, eloges in academy publications and memorials, and you have a meta-scientific genre that exceeds almost all others, giving history and philosophy of science a run for their money. A funny thing, then, that scientific biography as a genre has attracted relatively little comment in relation to biographical writing in other fields, to be sure. It has paled in relation to the preoccupation with most thematic topics in the history, sociology, and philosophy of science, technology, and medicine, too. Disciplines, societies and academies, laboratories, expeditions, science and literature, paradigms, women, you name it. More prevalent have been biographical essays on the quickly growing biographical literature, descriptive rather than analytical, and almost entirely lacking in reference to biography as an historical category in its own right. But this is beginning to change. The presence-absence paradox, as it has been called, is slowly being redressed. Disraeli may have admonished to, quote, read no history, nothing but biography, for that is life without theory. But Kundera was more tough-minded and probably closer to the truth. Biography, he wrote, is, quote, an artificial logic imposed on an incoherent succession of images. Why do we love biography so much? It's a question that may have as many answers as there could be biographies, and perhaps best left to such hearts and minds as described by Twain. But there are words to spend on scientific biography, nevertheless. Its history and changes over time, changing uses over time principally, before the questions raised by its craft, not least the challenges faced by its craftsmen and craftswomen, and its horizons. Biography is not only a sign of the biographer, but a sign of the times, a weather vane by which to measure the changing intellectual temperature, in fact, a fascinating window into the history and philosophy of science as evolving disciplines. Biography has a history, and that history can teach us a lot about the development of views surrounding science. Looking closely at the evolution of the genre sheds light on how different cultures at different times answered the question, what is science? What is not science? So too does it trace an oscillating trajectory concerning whether scientific thought is considered to be independent of politics and of culture, of time and place, whether such a thing as objective truth exists, and what the role of the scientist is or should be in society. Alongside such considerations, the genre of scientific biography invites reflection on how we write about science and scientists artistically, and why that matters. And so, from the outset, the biographical genre addresses itself to two kinds of concerns. The first, contextual, having to do with science and scientists as agents and subjects of history. The second, aesthetic, having to do with how lives and ideas entwined in them are expressed and communicated. These have been called the cultural historical poetics of the genre on the one hand, and the literary poetics on the other. Just take a bit of water. An appreciation of biography flutters like an intoxicated biography between these two linked considerations. For as Adam Gopnik has remarked, quote, whatever our official pieties, deep down, we all believe in lives. If you ask a cultural studies maven who believes in nothing but collective forces and class determinisms, how she came to believe in this doctrine, she will begin to tell you eagerly the story of her life. How then have scientific lies been told throughout history? The question beckons to, in light of the fact that the term scientist was only invented by the English polymath William Ewell in 1840. Now, I don't have time to talk about the craft of biography, an issue that's particularly close to my heart, but what I'd like to speak about in the short time that I have is really just a short history of the genre of scientific biography. And I'd like to start in ancient times. Romans and Greeks very much enjoyed writing the lives or bioi of fellow countrymen, very seldom women of note, but these represented a set of overlapping traditions, embracing works of varying forms, style, length, and truthfulness. Usually bioi were a celebration of someone's exemplary life, oftentimes including a section on his opinions or doxai, oftentimes detailing the succession of teachers and influences. In many cases, as in Plutarch's Parallel Lives of Greek and Roman Heroes, they were a form of aretology, paeans to virtue, arete, to be used for moral instruction, a display of the rewards of duty performed, the traps of ambition, the fall of arrogance. But eulogies, encomia, bioi, and doxographical writings bled into each other with little demarcation. Beyond the common themes of celebration, moral edification, and intellectual lineages, there really is no well-defined biographical genre of which to speak. Still, consider Pythagoras, according to Alfred North Whitehead, the founder of European philosophy and mathematics. Comparing three ancient bioi of her subject, written some 7 centuries after his death in the 5th century before BCE, Lisa Taub shows how the writing of ancient lives often served as a way for a particular school of thought to construct its own intellectual history. In the case of Pythagoras, this included both a scientific, mathematical, and religious ethical philosophy aimed at defining and strengthening the school by advocating a Pythagorean lifestyle. Characteristically for ancient bioi, the past is harnessed for the present and for the future. Thus, the intellectual and archaeological aspects are not always easy to disentangle, nor is historical record from myth and lore. Alongside the claim that it was Pythagoras who first introduced weights and measures into Greece, Laertius tells us that once he disrobed, quote, Pythagoras' thigh appeared to be gold, and that after 207 years in Hades, he has returned to the land of the living. Porphyry and Iamblichus's accounts are often interpreted in the light of the rise of the Christian Gospels and the Neo-Pythagorean attempt to counter Christ with a hero of their own. No wonder Iamblichus starts with a lineage tying his protagonist to Zeus. If many ancient renderings are protreptic rather than Rankian, medieval lives of natural philosophers, such as accounts of the learned men of the golden age of Islam or of Latin saints, lean heavier on hagiography, to be sure, than on contextualization. As the Renaissance ushered in the Hellenic tradition of writing secular lives, hagiography became wedded to the new humanistic sensibility, including writing on women. But it was a tradition of orationes funebres, in the manner of eulogies of university professors and memorials in biographical dictionaries, that dominated the telling of 16th and 17th century scientific lives. It is perhaps with Descartes' Discours de la Méthode, 1637, that we most strongly confront the chasm between our own conception of identity and those of earlier ages. The tones of the author's self-awareness, the timbre of his moral integrity, his approach to responsibility, his notion of personhood, differ starkly from our own modern sensibilities in this autobiography. Rather than capturing his own state of mind, Descartes is at pains to describe what the state of mind of a man of his calling should be, to paint the contours of the appropriate mentality of a natural philosopher of his age. Likewise, before him, Bacon, in New Atlantis and the Advancement of Learning, sought to rebel against an ideal of the philosopher inherited from classical antiquity and the Christian Middle Ages, in which otium, or contemplation, was valorized over negotium, or the active participation in the affairs of state. Both Bacon and Descartes could sense it. The times called for a radical new kind of thinker, not a limp scholastic cleric, but rather a public hero in whom the moral sage and the natural philosopher combine in equal measure to create new works for the betterment of mankind. It was a type, not an individual in the biographical sense we hold today, which is why Descartes begins the Discours by saying, I intend this text only as a history, or if you prefer, a fable. Gradually, as with Mencenius's 230-page account of the life of Girolamo Fracastoro from 1731, and later Stover's 2-volume account of Linnaeus from 1792, the short elogues of the 17th century were supplemented by true vitae, book-length tomes resembling, at least superficially, what we would consider biographies. These were invariably written by scientists rather than historians, as were the histories of the scientific disciplines, mathematics, chemistry, physics, technology, zoology, now increasingly instituted in the universities and professional societies, such as the British Association for the Advancement of Science, established 1831. There was no great separation or tension between historiography of science and biography, other than that those scientists who tended to concentrate on one neglected the other. What united them, in the historian of science Arnold Thackeray's estimation, was that in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, both represented materials, quote, steadily accumulated to explain and justify the role of science in the national life. Science was coming into its own, elbowing for cultural room and challenging the humanities. As the genre grew in scope, so did it diversify, with writers and journalists diminishing the proportion of biographies contributed by scientists. Increasingly, the somewhat unsmiling format of life and letters gave way to colorful portraits aimed at showing the human face of the scientific enterprise. Scientific biography was losing its character of high literature, just as the history of science was coming into its own as an academic discipline. As the first professional practitioners convened in Paris at the turn of the century to discuss the boundaries of the field, and later created its first journal, ISIS, in 1913 in Belgium, they were at pains to promote the history of science rather than science necessarily, and the influence of scientist writers gradually waned. But could scientific biography account for serious history of science? George Sarton was optimistic. Like Auguste Comte, he believed that science drives history forward. The history of science would chronicle that advance. Except that progress in science was less a function of collective action, as in politics. It was rather, quote, largely the history of a few individuals. Above all, Sarton wrote, we must celebrate heroism wherever we come across it. The heroic scientist adds to the grandeur and beauty of every man's existence. The sentiment was echoed by Douglas McKee, founder in 1936 of the Annals of Science, the British counterpart to ISIS, which had since migrated to the United States. His pages, he determined, would employ biography generously to, quote, recall the story, nay, the romance, of love for natural knowledge and devotion to its pursuit, to help evoke a widened sympathy and interest for the subject. Thus, the history of science recognized biography as a distinct genre and, to begin with, embraced it. It didn't last long. Biography was, quote, a defective kind of antiquarianism, pronounced Herbert Butterfield in the first issue of the Bulletin of the British Society for the History of Science in 1950. Serious history of science dealt with a synthetic study of historical changes in scientific thought, not with, quote, anecdote, or, as the American medievalist Charles Homer Haskins had called it, the distributions of medals for modernity. It culled its sources from more than mere personal papers and considered the notion of the scientist hero the legacy of a quaint 19th century ideal. And so a Cold War generation of historians, born in and around World War I, and including I.B. Cohen, Alistair Crombie, Marshall Claggett, A. Rupert Hall, Charles Gillespie, and Thomas Kuhn, became strongly influenced by the sensibilities of the émigré Frenchman Alexandre Koyré, whose Études Galiléennes exemplified biography that skewed psyche and style and disposition and temperament in favor of disembodied intellectual history. Scientific ideas were what counted, not personalities. It may perhaps not be surprising that many of this generation of historians of science had trained to begin with in the sciences. Their insistence on, quote, pure intellectual history and rejection of romance and antiquarian curiosity reflected a desire to justify their new calling. Prominent historians of science without a scientific background, at any rate, like Edward Lurie, who wrote a biography of Agassiz in 1960, and L. Pierce Williams in his Michael Faraday from 1965, were less at pains to make that distinction. Neither were a new breed, the science writer, such as the former war correspondent Ronald Clark, who produced popular biographies of Julian Huxley, J.B.S. Haldane, Einstein, Bertrand Russell, Edison, Freud, Ben Franklin, and Charles Darwin. Biography was gaining serious commercial appeal just as it was being shunned within the profession. When Crombie founded the Journal of History of Science in 1962, contra McKee, he didn't invite biographical studies, and the editorial board of the Dictionary of Scientific Biography cautioned contributors in 1970 that personal biography be, quote, intentionally kept to a minimum consistent with explaining the subject's place in the development of science. The skepticism of biography inherited by the Cold War generation of historians of science was more or less imbibed wholesale by the generation that took its cue from Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. This had much to do with the newly espoused intellectual aesthetic that cultural values and political ideology undermined individual contribution because individual cognition itself is derivative of collective arrangements. Science studies had gone social. What was the use of delving into the mind of a Clausius if thermodynamics was the invention of an age? And so those who sought to defend the genre people like Thomas Hankins, or Robert Young, did so by fashioning biography as ancilla historiae. Lives made sense because they helped contextualize social history. The stratagem actually worked. Adrian Desmond called his magisterial biography of Huxley a, quote, story of class, power, and propaganda. Disraeli's quip about biography constituting history minus theory was good enough, perhaps, for the literature, Desmond explained, but it would be a rash biographer today who ignored the new contextual and sociological approaches to science in Darwin's century. It was this approach to biography as a kind of crutch to social history that ushered the genre back into the fold of the history of science. But a further development, more radical, challenged the notion of disembodied selves, and hence the Coirean ideal more dramatically. Already in the 1920s, Virginia Woolf shocked contemporaries with a room of one's view, sparking a debate in which the use of narrative process to tie between autobiography and biography undermined the Victorian epitomes upon which her generation had been reared. But it would take a different age of feminists and gender studies scholars in the 1970s to mount a challenge to social history and literature and place biography center stage again. How, after all, can a life be written when the personal and the social are so inextricably linked, when cognition itself is so radically gendered? 3 minutes. It was against this backdrop that science historian Evelyn Fox Keller's biography of the American cytogeneticist Barbara McClintock became a minor classic in the history of science and in gender studies. Fox Keller's protestations that she was not advocating a feminine but rather a gender-neutral way of scientific thinking in describing McClintock's challenge to the genetical theory of her day did little to quell the excitement. Science may be perceived by many of its practitioners and followers as a detached, supranational community of rational men churning out objective knowledge, but there was more to it than that. There were women, and feeling, and intuition, and of course, a more modern corpuscularized social. Drawing on a new generation's mastication of Kuhn, historians of science now began to conceive of science as belonging to a place, as disunified, in possession of no unique set of values, dependent on tacit knowledge, and performed, rather than revealed, by practitioners with diverse moral and cognitive styles. Truth with a capital T gave way to credibility and consensus. Whatever else, scientists were not disembodied generators of immaculately insulated ideas. Lives matter. Gender matters. Practice matters. Relationships matter. Indeed, even things like love affair and diets matter. Food for thought, in the words of Steve Chapin. And so, alongside its reinvention as a crutch to social history, the feminists' challenge too, and the evolution of modern sociology of science, saw the genre of biography resurge in the latter part of the 20th century. Today, and I'll end with this, biographers of scientists may wonder, together with general historians, what sets biography apart from microhistory, or what role biography can play in lowering the tone. But promotion committees in history of science departments no longer look down upon the genre. Gone are the days of Claude Bernard's "art is I, science is we," or T.H. Huxley's exhortation that, quote, "what we care about in a light is that it shows the way, not whether it is a lamp or a candle, tallow or wax." To the contrary, owing to its appeal to large audiences, historians of science often now lament the fact that professional writers perennially steal the very best stories of lives from under their noses. So I think that Sam, our beloved, intelligent, wonderful, wonderfully warm-hearted, scientifically deep, generous humanist Sam, would have agreed that this is a sort of modicum of progress. Thank you very much.
We have about 5 minutes for questions and comments. It's late.
אם אנחנו באמת מסתכלים על הביוגרפיה העכשווית בתור איזו דרך לשלב יחד את היחיד ואת החברתי, אז השאלה, מה אנחנו עושים לחברתי? לא מה אנחנו עושים ליחיד, מה אנחנו עושים לחברתי כשאנחנו עושים אותה?
אז אני דיברתי דווקא על האופן שבו הביוגרפיה חזרה לתוך הפורד של היסטוריה של המדעים באופן לגיטימי. זה לא היה prescriptive, זאת אומרת, יש עדיין היום כל מיני סוגים של ביוגרפיה. יש אנשים שמתעניינים ב-Biography ואין להם עניין גדול בשאלות חברתיות. ולכן, אם אנחנו מדברים על הביוגרפיה בת זמננו, אז יש הרבה מאוד טיפוסים מהסוג הזה. אבל אם לוקחים ברצינות את האופן שבו אנשים כמו יונג והנקינס הכניסו באמת את הביוגרפיה חזרה לתוך ההיסטוריה של המדעים ככלי לגיטימי להתעסק בשאלות היסטוריות, אז פה אני חושב שהתשובה לשאלה שלך היא באמת קשורה לכישרון. כמו הרבה דברים בחיים. זאת אומרת, יש דרכים לעשות את זה בצורה מאוד מאוד לא משכנעת, ומה שאנחנו עושים שם זה בסטרדיזציה מוחלטת של the social. יש דרכים אחרות באמת להשתמש ביחיד כאיזה סוג של פריזמה שדרכה את מסתכלת על תופעות חברתיות, תרבותיות ואינטלקטואליות יותר רחבות, הרבה מעבר לפרט עצמו. וזה באמת נוגע לשאלה של קראפט, שזה משהו שפשוט לא היה לי זמן לדבר עליו, ואני אשמח, אבל אני חושב שהתשובה במילה אחת זה כישרון. אפשר לעשות את זה טוב ואפשר לעשות את זה לא טוב. אני לא חושב שיש דירקטיבות. אני חושב שיש פשוט את הדבר עצמו, או שהוא עובד או שהוא לא עובד. לא הייתי כותב handbook לדבר הזה. בוא נאמר.
אני יודעת, זה מין שאלה או הערה בעקבות השאלה שככה זרקת, של היחס בין ביוגרפיות למיקרו-היסטוריות. אז יש איזשהו ספר, נדמה לי שיצא ב-1999, שערכה לורן דסטון, שנקרא Biography of Scientific Objects. נכון. ששם הביוגרפיות של האובייקטים, ולאובייקטים המדעיים יש ויטה אקטיבה וויטה קונטמפלטיבה, לא יודעת אם יש לך איזה הערה על זה. לא,
זה באמת נכון שנאמר בשני העשורים האחרונים יש איזה מין הרחבה של ההגדרה של ביוגרפיה, ויש ביוגרפיות של פרטים, של אנשים, יש ביוגרפיות גם ביוגרפיות קולקטיביות של בני אדם, אז אני וחבר שלי מייק דיטריק ערכנו 3 ספרים שבכל אחד מהם יש 20 מסות על אינדיבידואלים, אבל אנחנו הכנסנו אותם תחת צד של סוגים שונים של קטגוריות של מדענים, Dreamers, Rebels, Outsiders וכן הלאה. ואז יש גם כן פנייה מחוץ להומו ספיאן, אפשר לכתוב ביוגרפיות של זבובים במעבדה, או של משוואות, או של אורגניזמים כאלה ואחרים שונים מחוץ למעבדה. וכמובן שאפשר לכתוב גם ביוגרפיות של רעיונות, זאת אומרת שיש איזה, זאת אומרת, הכל שאלה של כמה אנחנו רוצים להתייחס ברצינות ובאופן פורמליסתי לתיאור הזה של ביוגרפיה. אז זאת באמת שאלה אם אתה כותב ביוגרפיה של רעיון, כמו למשל, לא יודע, ביוגרפיה של סטטיסטיקה, מהמאה ה-18 לתוך המאה ה-20, והמעבר בין הדמון של לפלס לדמון של מקסוול, ואיך זה, ואתה הופך את זה לביוגרפיה, אז מה המשמעות של לקרוא לדבר הזה ביוגרפיה? אני חושב שלעיתים המשמעות היא, יש 2 משמעויות. המשמעות היותר צינית זה לומר כמו שאמרתי, Biography is sell well, ולכן אנשים אוהבים לקרוא למה שהם כותבים Biography. והמשמעות האחרת זה שלפעמים זה עוזר לחשוב על הנושא שלך כאינדיבידואל. זה פשוט עוזר לארגן את המחשבות. אני רואה שדני מסכים, אבל אני באמת חושב, כאילו אם אתה חושב על לבן אדם יש התחלה, אמצע, סוף, יש לו חברים, יש לו אנשים שהוא מתעסק איתם, יש מקומות שבהם הוא פועל או היא, ואם אתה לוקח רעיון נורא מורכב, כמו, לא יודע מה, ההיסטוריה של ההתפתחות של הסטטיסטיקה מהמאה ה-19 לתוך המאה ה-20, ואתה חושב על זה כמו בן אדם, זה יכול להיות מאוד לעזר. אז אני מברך על הדבר הזה, כי ספרים מאוד טובים יצאו מזה. ויש כאלה שהם מאוד פורמליסטים, זאת לא ביוגרפיה, ובאמת, מי שרוצה להתעסק בשאלה מה ההבדל בין ביוגרפיה למיקרו-היסטוריה, אז שיבוסם לו, לא יודע, אולי יש שם משהו מעניין, אבל אני לא בטוח.
אבל שאלה קצרה ותשובה קצרה.
מה הקשר בין, אני רוצה להסתכל דווקא על קשר אחר, בין הביוגרפיה לבין הנובלה. הנובלה החצי מדעית, למשל אם אני חושבת על ג'ורג' אליוט, והצורה שבה היא כתבה בסוף המאה ה-19, היא כתבה סוג של, היא כתבה על רעיונות מדעיים באופן מאוד עמוק. אז כאילו, מה הגבול המפריד כאן בין ספרות לבין ביוגרפיה?
שוב, התשובה, כאילו, the short answer זה להגיד יש writers ויש professional academics. זאת הדרך הקלה, כאילו, להפריד בין השניים, ואני חושב שהרבה אנשים יתייחסו לזה ככה, אבל כמובן שיש אקדמיים שהם גם סופרים מאוד טובים. ושמה, מה ההבדל? לא יודע, לא, תחדדי את השאלה חווה.
לא, סליחה, אנחנו כבר ככה.
אנחנו בעבר. אז
נשאיר את זה ככה.
שוב, אני חושב שההבדל, יכול להיות שההבדלים מתמצאים בסופו של דבר גם כן במה שעניתי לסנאית, בכישרון.